You ever come across someone who feels everything so deeply, so accurately, that just being near them makes you feel emotionally exposed? That's what people often call a super empath. They are not just sensitive, they are aware. They love with depth, but they are far from naive. Now imagine this kind of person getting involved with someone emotionally avoidant. Someone who pulls back when things get close, who shuts down when real intimacy starts to form. At the beginning, the avoidant often feels like they are in control. They seem calm, distant, hard to read, even a bit untouchable. That distance gives them a kind of power in their mind. But over time, something starts to shift in a very quiet way. The empath doesn't fight that distance with noise or pressure. They don't chase in dramatic ways. Instead, they observe. They understand patterns, and slowly they begin to see the cycle clearly. The avoidant pulls away and the other person runs after them. That chase becomes predictable, almost automatic. In that cycle, the avoidant feels safe because they believe they control the emotional closeness. But a super empath eventually stops playing that game. Not out of anger, not as manipulation, but because something inside them clicks into self-respect. At first, they may still try, still reach out, still try to understand the silence, still try to make things feel safe for the other person. But then comes the realization that no amount of effort can create connection where it is being refused. You can't build closeness alone. So their behavior starts to change, quietly. They stop over-explaining, they stop being the first to text, they stop asking if everything is okay, they stop filling every silence with effort, and instead they start respecting their own energy. This is not loud. It doesn't come with conflict. It's calm. But it completely changes the emotional rhythm. And this is where it begins to unsettle the avoidant. Because the empath was the consistent presence, the one who showed care, the one who stayed emotionally available even when things felt distant. That presence created a kind of emotional safety the avoidant didn't have to think about. And now, suddenly, that steady energy is gone. The empath hasn't disappeared out of bitterness. They've stepped back because they've stopped chasing something one-sided. They've stopped trying to earn closeness that should have been mutual from the start. It's a return to self. That shift creates something uncomfortable for the avoidant. The emotional silence that used to be filled by the empath's effort is now just silence. No chasing, no fixing, no reassurance on demand, and that's where the avoidant starts to feel what they were not willing to feel before. Questions begin to surface. Why did they stop reaching out? Did I push them away? Did I lose something I didn't fully value? The space the empath leaves behind becomes louder than any argument ever could, because now the avoidant is left alone with what they usually escape from: emotional responsibility and vulnerability. What makes the empath's withdrawal powerful is that it isn't performative. There is no drama in it. It's simply clarity. A quiet message of, I understand what this dynamic is, and I'm no longer participating in it. Instead of reacting emotionally to distance, they mirror it. If the other person pulls back, they stop overextending. If communication becomes inconsistent, they match that same level of energy. Not to punish, but to reveal reality. And that reflection is what the avoidant struggles with the most, because avoidance only works when someone else keeps filling the gap. When the empath stops doing that, the imbalance is exposed. There is no more cushion, no more emotional buffering, just the raw shape of the connection as it actually is. At first, the avoidant might interpret this as coldness or change in attitude, but in reality, what they're feeling is the loss of emotional management. The empath is no longer carrying the emotional weight for both people, and that creates discomfort because now they are being met with truth instead of pursuit. A super empath also naturally holds space. They can sit with silence. They can listen without forcing answers. They can understand emotional distance without reacting to it immediately. Early on, they often become the safe place for the avoidant to retreat into and come back from. But they don't stay in that role forever, because over time, they start noticing when their openness is not being met with effort in return. And when that realization settles in, something quiet but firm changes. They don't announce it, they don't threaten it, they simply step back emotionally. Where they once reached out, they now wait. Where they once carried conversations, they now observe. And where they once filled silence with patience, they now let silence exist. This is not withdrawal from care. It is withdrawal from self-abandonment. And when a person who once gave understanding without limits finally says, even without words, "This is no longer balanced for me," it lands differently, not as attack, but as truth. Because in that moment, the empath is no longer trying to fix what the other person refuses to face. They are simply choosing not to lose themselves in it anymore. And that kind of boundary doesn't usually turn into conflict. It doesn't create noise, it creates space, a kind of vacuum, because suddenly the avoidant is no longer receiving the emotional cushion they got used to. The empath, who once felt like a steady presence in the background, is no longer available for emotional outsourcing. And that shift can feel surprising to the avoidant, not because they were pushed or pressured, but because they weren't. They were given space, often more than enough. But silence doesn't mean blindness. The empath wasn't ignoring what was happening. They were watching, noticing, waiting to see if the avoidant would choose growth when given the chance. And when it becomes clear that nothing is changing, they make a different choice. They choose themselves. That decision isn't about giving up on someone. It's about no longer standing alone in a space that was meant for two people. It's calm, grounded, and quiet. And that is exactly what unsettles the avoidant the most, because it carries no anger, only clarity. A super empath is naturally sensitive to emotional pain even when it doesn't belong to them. They often pick up on fear, withdrawal, and discomfort and interpret it with understanding instead of judgment. In the beginning, this makes them extremely patient with avoidant behavior. They absorb moods without complaint. They question themselves when things go wrong. They ask what they did, even when the situation had nothing to do with them. That kind of self-reflection slowly creates an opening for imbalance. Because avoidant individuals often struggle with emotional discomfort, they tend to deflect when things feel too close. They minimize issues, they shift responsibility. Sometimes they suggest the other person is too sensitive or asking for too much. At first, the empath tries to adjust. They try to be softer, quieter, easier to understand. They try to reduce friction so connection can survive. But over time, a pattern becomes clear. No matter how careful they are, responsibility for every emotional tension still ends up on them, and eventually, something shifts internally. The empath begins to see the cycle for what it is: distance from one side, confusion from the other, and no real accountability in between. In that moment, they stop taking responsibility for emotional patterns they didn't create. It doesn't come with confrontation, it comes with withdrawal of overfunctioning. They stop over-explaining. They stop defending themselves when misunderstood. They stop chasing clarity from someone unwilling to give it. When they are told they are overreacting, they no longer argue to prove otherwise. When conversations are avoided or deflected, they no longer push to fix them. They simply step back internally. And that quiet shift changes everything, because the avoidant is no longer receiving emotional compensation for their distance. The empath is no longer softening every gap, no longer translating emotional shutdown into something they must tolerate or repair. This absence of reaction creates discomfort, not because the empath is doing something harsh, but because they are no longer doing something unnecessary. The emotional structure that once felt stable to the avoidant starts to collapse. The usual pattern no longer works. There is no chase, no repair, no emotional cushioning, just space. And in that space, something unavoidable appears: consequence. For the first time, the avoidant is faced with emotional silence that is not being filled by someone else. And that silence is difficult to ignore. The empath, meanwhile, is not acting out of resentment. They are simply no longer participating in imbalance. They are no longer explaining away behavior that repeatedly dismisses their emotional needs. Over time, they realize something important. Holding space for someone who refuses to meet them halfway is not compassion anymore. It is self-abandonment. So they stop, not loudly, not dramatically, just steadily. And this is often when the real shift happens, because the empath doesn't leave in anger. They leave after understanding. After repeated moments of being unheard, unseen, or emotionally minimized. They don't leave to punish. They leave because staying means losing themselves. Avoidant patterns often rely on the assumption that deeply caring people will stay no matter what. That patience has no limit. That understanding will always override neglect. But what they don't expect is that awareness eventually turns into action. And when the empath finally steps away, it is not a reaction to one moment. It is the result of many small moments that built up over time. The avoidant may feel confused. They may wonder why now, why this shift happened. But the answer is already in everything that no longer gets explained to them. No more emotional chasing, no more repeated understanding without change, no more silence being turned into effort from the other side. Just distance matched with distance. And often, that is when the impact is felt most strongly. Not through conflict, but through absence. Because what disappears is not just a person, it is the emotional regulation they were quietly providing the entire time. In that absence, the avoidant is left alone with something they spent most of their life avoiding: emotional responsibility without someone else carrying it for them. And for the empath, the lesson is equally clear. Their depth is not the problem. Their care is not the weakness. The real strength appears when they stop using those qualities to stay in places where they are not met halfway. Real connection does not require self-erasure. It requires mutual presence. And when that is not there, choosing yourself is not loss. It is clarity.